So let's talk about graphing absolute value equations today. And as you can see, an absolute value equation is going to make a V shape every single time. So because it makes a V shape every single time, if you think about drawing the V, you only really need to know the starting point. Because once I know the starting point of the V, I can just kind of send it out. Now I do need to know some of the width information too, but the most important point is where it's going to start at, or the bottom of the V. So the most important part of this graph is right here. The bottom of the V, or the bottommost point, is called the vertex. This is the most important point that we are going to find. This is the bottommost point. Or the topmost point, if it's facing upside down. But it's that bottommost point or that topmost point. So let's see if we can find some vertexes for these things. Now in this one, because the vertex is the bottommost point, it's when the absolute value is as small as it can possibly be. So I'm going to think, what number would make this absolute value as small as it could possibly be? Well, let's think for a second. It can't be negative. And the reason it can't be negative is anytime an absolute value is negative, it turns it into positive. So if you had like a -3 in there, you get a +3. So that's not as small as it could possibly be. So I got to think about the smallest possible positive number, which would be 0. So that would be the smallest possible positive number. So we got to think, what would make this thing right here 0? Well, what would make that thing right here 0 would be if x equals -3. So again, all I'm trying to do is make this part 0, and so it is 0 when x is -3. So that's my vertex. And I plug that in. That's my -3. And -3 plus 3 is 0. And 0 minus 1 is -1. That's my first point. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one point that is above it and one point that is below it. So one point that would be above would be -2. And one point that would be below would be -4. And I always want to go in order. I want to go from least to smallest. So -4, -3, -2. Then I'd plug those things in. -4 plus 3 would be -1. But my absolute value, so I'll plug these things in down here. So I would have plus 3 minus 1. That would give me -1. The absolute value of -1, though, is a +1. So I'd get 0. Let's solve this other one in blue and do the exact same thing. So now we'll plug in -2. -2 plus 3 is +1. And the absolute value of +1 is 1. And 1 minus 1 is 0. So this other one is 0. So that is my table. And if I use this table right here, I can make a graph from it. So I'm going to go graph this thing. So I have a point that's 3, or -3, 1, 2, 3, and -1, so a point right there. 4, -4 is 0, a point right there. Whoops. Go away, buddy. Point right there. And a point at -2, 0, so a point right there. And then we will make our V shape. So there's our absolute value. Let's try one more of these. Okay, so again in this example, we want to start by finding the vertex. We can find the vertex by what number makes this inside part 0. So the number that would make this inside part 0 would be -1. Because -1 plus +1 would be 0. So let me put that in. I'll have a -1 here. One number that's below that is -2, and one number that's above that is 0. And let's plug in, I'm going to erase this 1 over here. Let's plug in those points and see what we get. So when we plug that in, I'll have 2, -2, +1, -3. When I solve that, I'd get 2 absolute value of -1, -3. Absolute value of -1 is +1. +1 times 2 is 2. So I get -1 right here. If I did that for the second one, well, that becomes 0. 0 times 2 is 0. -3 is -3. And we'll plug in the last one, so 0 plus 1 minus 3. Well, that's just going to become 0 or 1. Well, then I would get 2 minus 3, which equals -1. Now, something that you should probably notice at this point is that these numbers are the same. And that's a good way to check. Since this is a V shape, if you pick the middlemost point and then 1 point away and 1 point away, those numbers should have to be the same. Like, no choice, they should have to be the same. So again, I can go over here and graph this thing. So let me get my snipping tool. Whoops. Erase this stuff over here. Get my pen again. And let's go. So -1, -3. Point right there. Come on, buddy. Oh, and a point at 0, -1, so a point right there. If it will draw. Normally I don't have this much trouble with the snipping tool, because it doesn't want to draw today. And then one more point at -2, or -3, -1, which would be right there. We make our V shape, and we're done. So again, for this thing, you need to find the vertex. To find the vertex, you need to make this thing right here 0. After you find the vertex, that's this point here, you're going to pick 1 point below and 1 point above. Plug those things into the original equation. Finish out this thing, which is called a t-table. And after you do that, you will just graph the points. And that's how you graph an absolute value equation.